Good morning, and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Benjamin Gadan. I direct our Latin America program here. I am thrilled to be partnering today with my colleagues at the Wilson Center's Global Europe program and its director, Robin Quinville, with the Spanish Embassy in Washington, the EU Delegation in Washington, and with the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. The Spanish EU presidency has sharpened the EU's focus on Latin America. That was clear in July in the summit in Brussels, which brought together the European and Latin American and Caribbean leaders for the first time in 8 years. At that meeting, the EU announced 45 billion euros in new planned investments in infrastructure in the Americas through its Global Gateway program. We've also seen accelerated conversations on a potential EU-Mercosur free trade agreement. This greater European focus on Latin America has presented a historic opportunity for the United States and the EU to deepen their partnership in the Western Hemisphere. After all, the US and EU share a wide range of values and national interests in this strategic region, and both recognize the region's vulnerabilities, including an unprecedented migration crisis, the intensifying impacts of climate change, and widespread disillusionment with traditional political parties and democratic institutions. Both also recognize the growing influence of other external actors in Latin America, which do not necessarily condition their engagement, their assistance, and their commercial relations on shared democratic values. To encourage deeper transatlantic cooperation in the Americas, the Wilson Center and our terrific partners are co-hosting a series of public and private conversations during Spain's presidency of the European Council. The next dialogue, which will take place on November 20th here at the Wilson Center, will address ways the US and EU could better protect Latin America's extraordinary biodiversity, both at sea and in its forests, and to accelerate the region's energy transition and increase the region's role in the global energy transition through engagement in clean energy supply chains. Today, we're addressing another area that calls out for urgent US-EU collaboration in Latin America and the Caribbean, the defense of democracy. As many of you know, Latin America's democracies are under tremendous stress. Only a few decades ago, the region was a model for democratic transitions, as countries such as Argentina, Brazil, and Chile freed themselves of prolonged military rule. Today, in some ways, the region's democracies remain models of resilience. As Argentina celebrates 40 years of uninterrupted democracy, this month it will once again hold free and fair elections to choose new leaders and lawmakers to wrestle with the country's immense economic challenges. Just last night, its two presidential candidates participated in a spirited debate. As Chile commemorates 50th anniversary of the 1973 military coup, it is channeling the public anger exhibited in the 2019 nationwide protests into an orderly constitutional reform process with a vote on a proposed new charter scheduled for December. Yet in many other ways, the region's democracies are in greater peril than at any other time in the modern democratic era. They are menaced not by the type of military takeovers that were common in the bad old days, but by a new threat, the gradual erosion of democratic institutions, typically by elected leaders. That process has already strangled democracy in Nicaragua and Venezuela, which have joined Cuba among the region's dictatorships. All three regimes are notorious for silencing dissent, including by imprisoning critics. The Venezuelan leader is now under investigation by the International Criminal Court for alleged crimes against humanity. Worryingly, other countries in the region appear to be on the same path. That includes El Salvador, where civil liberties have been suspended for more than a year, and the president is running for a second term despite an apparent constitutional prohibition on re-election. Polarization and public anger and disillusionment are other perils, as we saw in Brazil in January, when opponents of the president stormed the presidential palace, the Supreme Court, and the Congress in a failed attempt to overturn a democratic election result. In response to these challenges, the region's courageous civil society leaders have rushed to the barricades. But as we have heard in dialogues at the Wilson Center in recent months, civil society organizations are increasingly under assault, verbally bullied by presidents, starved of international support, and harassed by local tax authorities. For journalists, reporting on public corruption or organized crime in the region is increasingly dangerous. The result is too often self-censorship or exile. As we discussed at a private roundtable this morning, just before this event, these defenders of democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean are in desperate and urgent need of greater international support, and the US and EU, ideally working in close partnership and coordination, are the region's best hope to reverse this trend. Fortunately, neither the White House, State Department, EU, or European leaders need much convincing. President Biden has described the global fight for democracy as the greatest struggle of our time. As for the EU, and you'll hear this in today's conversation, there's a robust commitment in Brussels and European capitals to move quickly before it's too late. There is also a clear desire, as we'll hear from our colleague in the Panamanian Foreign Ministry, to partner with the United States and Europe more closely on these issues. I'll share one more reason for hope before I turn to the Spanish ambassador, Santiago Cabanas, and then to our panelists, Frank Mora, the U.S. ambassador to the Organization of American States, Enrique Iturriaga Saldana, Director General for Iberoamerica and the Caribbean for the Government of Spain, Tomas Reyes, Chair of the Working Group on Latin America at the European Council, and Panama's Foreign Minister, Hanaina Tewani. A few weeks ago, the president-elect of Guatemala was on this same stage, warning of a slow-motion coup by the country's attorney general and influential political and economic actors trying to keep him from taking power. Fortunately, as he repeatedly pointed out, he's not alone in this struggle. EU election observers and their counterparts at the Organization of American States, all strongly supported by the United States, have remained engaged in Guatemala since the election to prevent a democratic collapse that would be difficult to reverse, a lesson we have all learned elsewhere in this region. I'm excited to hear more about how the US and EU support for democracy in Guatemala can be a model replicated elsewhere in the Americas, including in Venezuela, as we work to consider new structures, institutions, and partnerships between the US and EU to protect and defend democracy throughout the Americas. Please let me thank you all for your interest in this, both those of you in the room today and the many of you following us online and engaging in our other activities throughout the Spanish presidency. I want to recognize the many senior diplomats who have joined us today, including the ambassadors from Latvia and from Paraguay, Spain's ambassador to the Organization of American States, the U.S. Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Mark Wells and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Enrique Roig, my colleague Diego Aria from the Atlantic Council's Latin America program, Eva Buendia from the Spanish Embassy, my colleagues at the Wilson Center, Robin Quinville, Beatriz Garcia-Nice, and Oscar Cruz, who have played a critical role in this and other activities as part of this series. Again, thank you for being here for this urgent conversation. Ambassador Cabanas, please.
Good morning, and thank you, Benjamin. Thank you very much for organizing this event. Thank you to the Wilson Center and to all your wonderful colleagues. And thank you, indeed, to the Atlantic Council and to the European Delegation here for the cooperation during these months of our Spanish presidency. Indeed, we wanted to highlight the importance that Spain attaches to the relations with Latin America. We face many challenges in the world, and we believe we can only face them if we work together, if we enhance the transatlantic relationship. But we also need to put Latin America at the core of that transatlantic relationship. And that is why I think this is a very convenient and very, very timely conversation, the one that we're going to have here. And I want to thank our panelists here, representative, the Foreign Minister of Panama, the Director General of Iberoamerica from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the U.S. Ambassador to the OAS, and representative of the European Commission. And with that, I would ask Lila Abed, who is going to moderate the conversation today, to take the floor. And again, thank you, Benjamin, and thank you to the Wilson Center. I hope we can continue this conversation and this cooperation after our presidency. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Benjamin, and thank you, Ambassador. Good morning to everybody. I'm Lila Abed, the Deputy Director of the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center, and it is my great pleasure to be moderating this wonderful conversation with an excellent group of panelists. I just want to go over a few housekeeping items before I formally introduce our speakers. While this event will be in English, we all speak Spanish as well, but it will be done in English. Everybody in person has the ability to have access to simultaneous translations. For those of you viewing this event virtually, a Spanish version of today's event will be available in the Latin American program's website in the upcoming days. With that said, I am very excited again, and thank you, Benjamin, for the opportunity to do this morning. So today, as Benjamin had mentioned previously, Hanaina Tewani, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Panama, is here with us virtually. Thank you so much, Minister, for being here this morning. Enrique Eric Iturriaga Saldaña, Director General, Iberoamerica and the Caribbean for the Government of Spain. Tomás Reyes, Director of COLAC, and Frank Mora, U.S. Ambassador to the OAS. I'm going to start with an initial question that I'm going to pose to all of our panelists, and we will start a more dynamic conversation once everybody has been able to answer the question. But Minister Tewani, why don't we start with you? Latin America, as both Benjamin and the ambassador mentioned, has seen a decline in democratic institutions in recent years. How can the EU, Spain, Panama, the US strengthen the region's democratic institution? And is there an initiative or program that you would signal or that demonstrates the yielded positive results of strengthening democratic institutions in the region?
Muchísimas gracias y bueno, quisiera aprovechar para mandar un gran saludo a Benjamin y a los amigos que veo, que conozco, me siento en casa. Realmente lo primero que quisiera plasmar es desde la perspectiva de Panamá. Panamá es una democracia muy joven, realmente está en proceso de construcción. Desde nuestro proceso democrático que se fue construyendo en 1989, la sociedad se puso de acuerdo para lograr ciertas estructuras formales que nos permitieran, como sociedad, poder manifestarnos y también poder coexistir bajo instituciones preestablecidas formales desde 1989. Y hago referencia a la historia porque la historia, la geografía, define las características únicas de cada país. En el caso específico de Panamá, es un país muy especial, pues está en el centro del continente, con una vocación histórica suramericana, pero a su vez geográficamente definitivamente centroamericano, con una cultura caribeña impactante, pero que además de eso mantuvo 100 años de relación en el territorio, bueno, esos corazones no sé, 100 años de relación en el territorio coexistiendo con Estados Unidos, haciéndolo entonces la única república de la América Latina continental que tiene una historia paralela con los Estados Unidos. Desde 1989, cuando nuestra sociedad decidió transitar los caminos de la democracia, los instrumentos e instituciones que se establecieron nos permitieron mantener ese balance que ha caracterizado a la República de Panamá en el continente latinoamericano. Sin embargo, no somos una democracia perfecta. Y de hecho el día de hoy es un día importante y bastante icónico que yo me presente ante ustedes para hablarles de democracia. Nuestro país el día de hoy cumple 22 días de manifestaciones, algunos cierres de calle, inconformidad de la sociedad en conjunto, algunos grupos y fuerzas vivas de nuestro país que han afectado definitivamente lo que son esas estructuras formales que conocemos desde 1989 en la era democrática. ¿Y por qué hago un énfasis en esto? Porque sería irresponsable de mi parte como canciller decir que todo es perfecto. De hecho, lo que ha sucedido en estos últimos 20 días de en Panamá es importante para reflexionar internamente, pero en la región, de cuáles son las instituciones que mantenemos y que si esas instituciones que nos han transitado en la paz, la democracia y la estabilidad desde 1989 son up to date o están disponibles a los cambios y transformaciones que el mundo, la sociedad y la sociedad latinoamericana está llevando en estos momentos. Lo mencionó Benjamin al inicio. cuando habló de los cambios y las transformaciones que está teniendo nuestro continente. La pregunta es, ¿son esas estructuras que nuestra sociedad fundamentó, las bases y el hombro de la democracia que se fundamentaron desde el año 89, 90 en adelante, relevantes el día de hoy? ¿Son lo suficientemente participativas? Y ahí voy a la segunda parte de la pregunta. ¿Qué ha hecho nuestro gobierno? ¿Qué hizo nuestro gobierno? Llevó a cabo acciones que iban más allá de esas estructuras formales legales establecidas, porque estaba monitoreando el sentir social. Le voy a dar un ejemplo. Acciones específicas que se llevaron a cabo. La Constitución establece la manera de elegir los magistrados de la Corte Suprema de Justicia. Nosotros tenemos un balance de poderes, el ejecutivo, el legislativo y el judicial. Por primera vez en la historia, los magistrados fueron elegidos no por la designación de un presidente o por el gusto de lo que fuese el presidente, a pesar de que la ley lo permitía. Se hizo un proceso donde la sociedad civil presentó bajo un estudio independiente, analítico, quiénes eran las personas más apropiadas para llevar el cargo. Y la oportunidad que tuvo el presidente Cortizo de designar 5 fue histórica. Normalmente los presidentes no tienen el espacio de designar tantos. Ellos fueron designados en base a esa puntuación. Personas que no conocía y que no tenían ninguna relación previa con él. Algo que no se había hecho en la anterioridad. Pero si ves, no solo la estructura formal legal se cumple, sino que te corresponde ser creativo e ir más allá e identificar cómo tienes que avanzar en los derechos de los ciudadanos y la sociedad civil que participa en esta nueva gobernanza. Segundo, y una acción muy importante, fue el Pacto del Bicentenario, en tiempos de pandemia, cuando ya estábamos identificando la transformación que iba a tener el mundo entero. Llevamos a cabo un proceso de consulta gigantesco en el territorio nacional, donde cada ciudadano podía aportar y decidir en base a una plataforma que fue otorgada por las Naciones Unidas, Ágora, cómo veían a ese Panamá, post-pandemia, a ese Panamá del siglo XXI. Fue el proceso de consulta más amplio que ha tenido nuestro país, porque normalmente hemos tenido diálogos donde solo los líderes participan. Aquí cualquiera en el territorio pudo ser parte del mismo. Y ya finalizo mi intervención con lo último. Si nos tocó y nos correspondía ir más allá de lo que la estructura formal, de las estructuras, como lo dijo Benjamin, partidos tradicionales, estructuras tradicionales, reflejan y protegen y salvaguardan la gobernabilidad, la paz, la transición y la democracia en un país, probablemente es el momento adecuado, y justo en la coyuntura actual que vive Panamá, de revisar si hay un nuevo ciclo en nuestro país. Esos ciclos lo viven muchos países. De hecho, hay quienes mencionan que Estados Unidos tiene ciclo de 80 años. Yo siento que Panamá, y esta es una opinión ya personal, se encuentra en una coyuntura donde ha llegado un ciclo, yo le llamo el Panamá 3.0, para hacerle referencia a la tecnología. El Panamá 1.0 fue la separación de Colombia, el Panamá 2.0, el proceso de transición hacia Estados Unidos, y el 3.0 inició en el 2000, cuando decidimos caminar solos, cuando pudimos caminar solos como país, completamente responsables de nosotros mismos, sin que existiera la participación de otro Estado, otro país, que era Estados Unidos. Entonces, en esos años de transición, probablemente nos corresponde revisar esas estructuras. Y eso incluye la participación de todos en las complejidades nuevas de la sociedad actual, de esa nueva gobernanza, donde los jóvenes tienen igual poder que cualquier otro por medio de un teléfono, donde cualquier ciudadano tiene la capacidad de expresarse y ser escuchado. Siento que los estados, y en el caso específico de Panamá, mantener la democracia y la estabilidad requerirá de estructuras lo suficientemente sólidas, pero flexibles, para que a través de las tormentas y los torbellinos se puedan mantener y garantizar la democracia, el diálogo y la participación de todos.
Thank you so much, Minister Tawani. Ambassador Mora, your answer, how can the U.S. help the region to strengthen democratic institutions?
Thank you, Alida. Thank you for the opportunity, Benjamin, Ambassador. So there's two parts to your question, right? The sort of transatlantic cooperation and then specific what is notable, what is specific that we're doing in this particular space of democratic erosion. So on the area of transatlantic, I've often said, I'll repeat it again, I think international institutions are more important now perhaps than they've been in a while. The EU and of course the OAS. To put it simply, it's because the nature of the challenges we face, whether it's climate change or democratic erosion, really require a collective effort. No single nation on its own Spain or the United States can address these issues. So we have no other choice than to not just resort to international institutions, but I would say to strengthen those institutions. And I'm happy to elaborate on that if you like. I think that the EU and the OAS or EU members in the OAS have played a pivotal role in supporting the mission, particularly in the area of democracy. My colleague, Ambassador Monton, who's here, has been an incredible partner in that particular effort. Spain has supported electoral observation missions, development issues, and I can go on and on and on. So I'll be honest, I hope and expect that we can do more because we share common values. We share a common agenda for the region. We have a common understanding of the challenges facing the region. And I think there's more to be had there, particularly at this time for the reasons I explained, for the EU and the OAS to work closer together on this issue of democratic erosion. And I can perhaps give you a couple examples later. On the second issue, well, okay, so what are we doing? What is the OAS doing, and what is the United States in support of? So first I'd say that the United States and this particular administration has expressed a commitment to double down, if you will, on international institutions, to understand that we need them more than ever. And the Secretary of State said recently at Johns Hopkins University that international institutions, multilateral diplomacy, alliances is critical. It's a critical priority of the United States, and we're going to invest resources, time, political capital in those international institutions. I think that is exactly what we're doing. The same way that we are doubling down with democracy. Benjamin mentioned what the President of the United States, the 2 Summit for Democracy. So in a sense, there is this commitment again, or recommitment to strengthening democracy globally and to international institutions. And the two come together in an important way. So I'll just mention one. The OAS and the Inter-American system has an important instrument, a critical instrument, and that is the Inter-American Democratic Charter, right? This is a commitment that member states made September 11th, 2001, to essentially safeguard democracy. The first article of that charter, of that instrument, says that every citizen has the right to live in democracy. And then it says every government has an obligation to promote and defend democracy. We take that very seriously. I mean, we take the whole charter very seriously, but we take that point very seriously. So, recently at the last General Assembly and then subsequent to that, member states, and people talk about polarization and et cetera, and I'm not going to dispute that, but clearly 26 member states thought this is an important point to find ways to strengthening the charter for the moment today, because the challenges to democracy in 2001 are different than they are today. And we can talk about that as well. So how do we not open the charter for renegotiation, Lila, but how do we find ways of strengthening it, right? First is to express a recommitment to it, right? That we believe in this charter. We are doubling down on this charter. We are, and we need this now more than ever for reasons that have been explained. So we're going through a process debating, discussing, and finding ways where we can strengthen a charter. For example, one area which I think there will be consensus is on civic education in the region, right? How and what can we do, and where can we be strategic about how do we, in a sense, promote civic values and civic education, working with civil society and, of course, educational institutions to do just that. And by the way, not just in the Americas, I include the United States here as well. So we'll see how that process goes. To show or to demonstrate this commitment to not just democracy, but also to international institutions, the OAS Permanent Council, General Assembly approved an increase in the budget of the OAS for the first time, by the way, in 12 years, right? Again, this is a realization that this is, to me, in my mind, in our mind, indispensable institution to address issues like democracy and human rights and so on. And I'll end with this final point, Lita, is we hear about the great work that the Electoral Observation Mission does, and we've seen it over and over again. I mean, that, to my mind, is the gold standard, with all due respect to the European Union. And I think the work that they're doing, and they've done in Guatemala recently, et cetera, is critical. But also the Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is here. And again, that's another entity, another instrument that the organization, the Inter-American system, has to continue highlighting and bringing attention to human rights violations around, across the Americas, including the United States, right? I've had to go before hearings and explain what we've done or not done well with respect to human rights. And so those institutions, it seems to me, particularly at this time, need all the political support, not just from the United States, but frankly from the European Union and others, because, for example, the Commission gave us an early warning signal about Guatemala when they put Guatemala under Chapter 4. See, that's the kind of work, I think, a way of strengthening the Charter that tells us, yellow flag, yellow, 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 there's something going on here. We need to focus our attention to this. And sure enough, some years later, we know and we see what's happening in Guatemala. So, long answer to your question, but I think it's important that we do not separate the sort of cooperation, institutional strengthening, from the need to double down, to emphasize a common agenda, common values around democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Martin. I would love to go back to the new challenges, right, to democracy. They're very different, even since 2021. Right. Enrique, your remarks and to our EU colleagues, Tomas, I'll go with you once we are done hearing from Enrique. But I have to plug in Mexico here because I'm from the Mexico Institute, and something that I have always admired with the collaboration, particularly right between the EU and Mexico, is with this new global agreement that's being discussed. Apart from commercial commitments, there has been issues that have been arisen in these negotiations concerning climate change, reducing poverty, strengthening democratic institutions. There's a real almost commitment, right, from the EU to make sure that countries like Mexico do not deteriorate further democratically. So I'd love to hear what your vision is towards the region more broadly, and what the EU and the government of Spain is doing to strengthen democratic institutions in Latin America.
Bueno, gracias Lila.
Sí.
Dado que la canciller ha tenido la amabilidad de hablar en castellano, yo saludo tanto a la canciller como a Tomás. Todos aquí hablamos castellano. Hablaremos en inglés porque es lo que me han dicho que hagamos, pero es una hermosa lengua, así que ahora paso a otra hermosa lengua que es el inglés. Okay. Yes, I'll answer to that, although I think that Tomás is his remit to talk about the European Union. Although I'll just touch a little bit on the issues you raised. I think the first thing I must say that democracy is in crisis, yes, but is it only in crisis in Latin America? That's one question that we have to ask ourselves, because it is true that we always say in Spanish, we say that when Latin America, when the world gets cold, Latin America gets a pulmonía, in English.
Pneumonia.
It is that normally crisis, we've seen the crisis of Lehman Brothers, and then we've seen the crisis of COVID. COVID particularly has been very, very difficult in Latin America, as you know, with 8% of the population, 30% of the casualties. That shows that it's not only a problem that Latin America is close to China, which is not, but that the response was not the adequate. And why was that? But particularly because perhaps the state didn't deliver. And if the state doesn't deliver, then it is difficult to keep the institutions. We agree, institutions are very important. They're important all over the place. Even in Europe, we are having problems with our institutions. So it's a sort of general crisis, but we have to focus on Latin America. As I was mentioning before in our small gathering, that we need to keep the focus in Latin America because there are other crises that are more acute. We're talking about war, we're talking about casualties. In Latin America, fortunately, we are not there yet, I hope. The thing is that we, as Spain, and again, I limit myself to this national way we're dealing with it, we try to think in a multidimensional perspective because the problem is multidimensional. So first of all, we keep political relation, very close political relations with all countries in Latin America. Obviously, it's not the same having a good relation with Mexico than having a good relation with Nicaragua. We all know that. But we try to keep, we have embassies in all those countries. And we try to find a way, because in order to keep institutions, we need the states. You cannot talk about democracy in Latin America without the Latin Americans. So we have to start with a dialogue with Latin America. So we have political consultations with mostly, I think out of the 21, with 18 countries, which is a lot of work, I must say. But then we have also specific human rights consultations with them. And there we can talk about different levels of complying with international institutions, international regulations, because one of the things we must say that is the legally framework of human rights has been signed and implemented by almost the whole of Latin America, and the OAS is the example. And by the way, I have to say that Spain supports the OAS. We support also the electoral missions financially, and we have an excellent ambassador in the OAS. So we have had this idea of contributing to international organizations, regional international organizations, but politically, we are, apart from the dialogue that we have with them, we have a long tradition of supporting the peace processes in Latin America. Now we have a Colombian Paz Total, Total Peace, where we are sort of accompanying state with other European countries. And we also are trying to find a way to assist with the multilateral multilateral mission in Haiti. For the moment, we're expecting that Kenya decides whether they are going to preside over this or they're going to organize this mission. But we are also doing our work financially and probably with some officials. Then sanctions, we also work on that with the U.S. It's difficult always, the question of sanctions, because it is an exception in international law. So we always tend to have these sanctions approved by the Security Council, but it's not always the case. And in the case of Nicaragua and Venezuela, we keep, as the European Union, and perhaps Tomas can develop that further. We have just approved a revision of our sanctions to Venezuela. And I think that's another way of pressing for the respect of human rights. And finally, in the political respect, we have a very strong commitment to regional integration. We work with, as I said, EIS, but we also work with regional banks. And we negotiate commercial agreements, as you mentioned. And we have good news, by the way, because probably we'll have the modernization of the Chile agreement. in December. We are signing very soon, I think the 16th November, an agreement with ACP countries. So, and then the Belgian Parliament probably will give the ratification for the Central American Agreement. So we have good prospects with the Mercosur Agreement. Well, good. We have had good prospects for 30 years, but this time is a good one. And then with Mexico, well, you know, there's a energy chapter there. But yes, and again, Thomas, I refer to you. These agreements are not only commercial agreements; they're agreements called association agreements, right. And they have three pillars. And the commercial is the most important one. It takes us a lot of trouble, not only negotiating, but then ratifying in the European Union. But I think that's the way, because if we create progress and economic benefits, I think that we create stability, and that's something very important for democracy. So then I'll be more brief than I'm doing now. We have the economic layer, because apart from talking about democracy with the states, we have to talk with the private sector. And the private sector, in the case of Spain, is very active in Latin America, so you all know. And I think they're very, very committed to, apart from creating opportunities of investment, also creating social progress, because they go both hand in hand, at least in the European standard. And then social progress is also is inclusion. We have also a big community of Spaniards living in Latin America, as well as a big community of Latin Americans living in Spain. And I think that, as I was mentioning before, that the migration is an issue, and we're being very, very active in there. I think that the third layer of our policy towards supporting democracy in Latin America is working with the civil society and supporting the civil society. I think that the Defender program, the Democracy Defenders program, is a very important one. We are supporting, especially Colombia, 46% of the casualties of defenders, and there were 400 of them last year, come from Colombia, and Mexico too, Brazil. Those are the main countries in our program. And finally, I have to refer to our, I'm a bit long, but I have to say that we have a lot of things to do with Latin America. But I'll just mention very briefly our program for democracy. It was presented by the Minister of Foreign Affairs this year. We are dedicating 6 million euros for the program, and it has started with an all-encompassing process with multi-stakeholders. We had a first meeting with Latin American representatives of social media in Montevideo, then a second one in Santa Cruz de la Sierra for political and social actors, then a third one in Cartagena for economic and social, meaning as trade unions, and then a fourth one in Antigua, Guatemala, for the international and regional organizations plus think tanks. With all that, we have made a diagnosis. I can talk about that later if you like. We won't have time, but there are 10 points we're going to work on them. They've been mentioned. We know what the problem is, and we are going to try to tackle them with our Agency for Cooperation in 3 layers. One is pacts, social pacts, bringing people together in order to get not only constitutional democratic agreements, but also at the social level. Then a second one, which is supporting actors, especially civil society, as I mentioned. We have 3 or 4 projects already on the table. And then working on rights. I think that reforms, integral reforms in Latin America are very important in order to support and buttress democracy. We need a fiscal pact, that's for sure. Then probably labor pact and of course, regarding pension schemes. Those are all very important because it was mentioned that that democracy is in the wane in Latin America, that we mentioned Latin Barometro, always they say that Latin Americans increasingly distrust democracy. But when you talk to them, nobody wants to go to China. Everybody wants to go to the United States or to Europe. And that's because what they want is economic progress plus social inclusion. And that's our view of it.
Thank you, Enrique. Tomas, your remarks? Oh, I don't think we hear him. Tomas, I think you're on mute.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So good afternoon, good morning rather, everyone. Good afternoon from Brussels. Thank you very much for having me this evening. I was getting ready to intervene also in Spanish, but Spanish and Portuguese and many other languages spoken in the Caribbean are European languages, are official languages of the European Union. So these are one of the many things that bring us together, that we share. What I wanted to do briefly in this intervention, and to complement many of the very interesting things that have been said in this session, want you to take you to the summit that took place in Brussels on the 16th and 17th of July. It's been mentioned at the very beginning by the first guest, or our host rather. And he mentioned a figure. He mentioned the figure, yes, of 45,000 euros for the global gateway investment agenda. And I think it would be a mistake to consider that the summit was just about numbers, was about a figure. So I want to walk you through some of the outcomes of this important summit. And I think in those we will find also elements that uphold democracy, the rule of law, and these values that, again, we share with our partners across the Atlantic in South America and the Caribbean. So first of all, the summit itself. It's been said we hadn't had a summit with Latin America and the Caribbean for 8 years. Our High Representative said it at the very beginning of its mandate. Latin America and the Caribbean is not in the radar of the European Union, and that is a mistake. That's something that he wanted really to tackle and to find a solution. Why has that happened, and why shouldn't that happen again? What wasn't in the program, he also tells us, was a world pandemic, was a very tense geopolitical environment, and certainly not a war on European soil. These things were not in the program, as there is now other crisis in the Middle East that wasn't in the program. But those actually unforeseen events actually make this original aim of Borrell, and with him of the European External Action Service, to come together to come closer with Latin America and the Caribbean. So that takes us to the summit in July. Of course, the summit is 2 days of intense meetings and plenaries and different bilateral meetings and events. But there is a lot of preparation that took us to that event in July. And first, we work as European Union, the Commission, and the High Representative work in what we call a joint communication to the European Parliament, where we put all our thinking and our policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean. It's an important document, and that document, of course, centers also around very basic concepts of democracy, the state of law. And it's an ambitious document that actually has already been mentioned by Director General Iturriaga. Talks about the need for an enhanced political dialogue with the region at all different levels. We're talking about the regional level and the sub-regional level, and also the bilateral level. But it also talks about trade, about the importance of strengthening the trade relations, and that takes us to the agreements that you have mentioned. After all, if we cannot work to create wealthier and safer societies at both sides of the Atlantic, we would have failed. And I think that would be an interesting part of the conversation, maybe later on during this session. So the summit itself, we have this joint communication. Then we had a ministerial meeting that we hadn't had of foreign affairs ministers that we hadn't had for 5 years, and took us to Buenos Aires. And there was, I have to say this very bluntly, there was a realization that we cannot take the region for granted, that we need to listen, we need to understand what are the grievances, what are the problems, what is their perspective. So in that sense, and as difficult as it was to come up with a joint declaration from the co-chairs, it wasn't even a declaration of the ministers, I think it was a very good opportunity to listen in this format to each other. And that took us then later to the that took us to finally to the summit in Brussels. So we had the summit, and there was something of a relaunch friendship. I was in the room when the leaders came in, and really there was a need to see each other, to even touch each other. There was really a very beautiful atmosphere of leaders that hadn't been seeing each other for far too long. And I think this is something that we shouldn't repeat. Then there was the joint declaration. The joint declaration, of course, it's controversial. It's attracted a lot of attention over the issue of Ukraine, which of course was central for the EU member states. I think we managed to put in writing that there was an aggressor and that there was an aggression in this terrible war of aggression. That took a lot of effort. But if you look at that declaration, and I think again that shouldn't really take all the attention from the declaration. In the declaration, already in paragraph 7, there is a shared commitment for democracy, for human rights, for the rule of law. So that document is actually a diplomatic success in a way. It's signed by all the countries in the region, as you know, except one, over discrepancies over that infamous paragraph on Ukraine. That's Nicaragua. But that takes me to this idea which was behind the summit, which was to have an inclusive summit. That's also, I think, an important element that we need to underline. The European Union wants to engage with all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. There was no question about not inviting all of them. They were then represented at the level they decided, and then one of them isolated itself, but by not joining the declaration at the end. I think it's very important that we manage also to secure that we will have summits on a regular frequency. The idea is to have a summit every other year, every 2 years, and to also fix a next one in the LAC region in 2025. And in the meantime, there will be ministerial meetings. So it's important just not to fall into the same situation that took us to this summit, which is not to have this important highest level dialogue on a regular basis. And also, it's an important outcome of this summit is to have what we call a consultative coordination instance that will allow really to have the possibility to discuss not only the preparation of the summit, but many other issues in a loose coordination instance that will allow to avoid a vacuum of communication, and that we can do it from the European Union with CELAC. There's also a bi-regional roadmap or a series of events from now to 2023 to 2025 that will allow us to address all the issues on the agenda, including difficulties or crises in the democracy, in the democratic values. So it's important that we maintain that path of meetings. And of course, there was the Global Gateway. It has been mentioned. It was a 45,000 million. And as I said, it's important to look at this as an opportunity also to bring welfare and stability to the countries in the region. I think We have to concentrate on peace, on security, on a horizon that will allow people to uphold to the institutions that we say in our declaration, in our statement, that are so important. I think this is something that maybe we should really look into, our narrative of upholding democracy, rule of law. How does that affect the well-being? How does that affect the security of the citizens of Latin American and Caribbean countries? And I think that's an interesting discussion to have, as we see that in certain countries, security comes first, upholding democracy of the rule of law comes second, and security comes first. So how to adapt our narrative and how to explain that upholding to the rules-based order and to democratic institutions is actually the best way to have sustainable and secure societies. Maybe a word, I think there is room for also European Union observation missions. I think they have been fundamental also and well understood and respected by our partners in Latin America and the Caribbean, our methodology. Also, I had the chance to intervene in and to participate in a couple of follow-up missions in El Salvador and Honduras. They were very difficult missions, and but I could see how these missions really had an impact in the institutions, but also in the society, and the respect, and also the effect that these missions had to keep the electoral processes under sort of to avoid insecurity, for instance. And I remember how these processes, how these missions help to control and to avoid I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to say here is that there were no demonstrations. I mean, they were looking at the EU really as a source of information and just to keep things under certain control. You have talked about the trade agreements. This is extremely important. I think as Director Iturriaga just said, the Chile one is under control. The group that is within reach. The group that I chair every week finalize its work. I think it's really something possible that this can be signed, and we're aiming at that, to have the Chile agreement signed before the end of the year. Mexico and Mercosur also, their processes that are sometimes not right, but certainly it's a very important part of our offer to Latin America, and we need to uphold that offer. Finally, I've been already very long, but maybe a word of something which is important also, which is culture. The European Union will be the guest of honor this year in the Guadalajara Book Fair. I think it's important also for the EU to be recognized as an actor, to put an effort in this area, the area of culture, that will certainly will help to uphold democratic values and the rule of law. I will stop there, and then I will engage in the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomas. And to our in-person guests, we will have, I hope, several minutes for questions, so start thinking about them for our panelists. I'm going to go again to Minister Tawani. Enrique actually mentioned the latest Latino Barometro report, and I found it absolutely fascinating that in 2023, only 48% support democracy in the region, which is a 15% decrease from 63% in 2010. But if I may, I would add one additional data point, and that's that elites have also suffered a large decline in reputation. That is, at least 20 presidents from 1985 to 2023 have left office before their term was over. And so there is a real crisis not only in democratic institutions, but in the elites, in civil society. And Ambassador Mora said in his intervention that, multilateral alliances, organizations are more important now than ever. So how do you see triangular cooperation on democracy really benefiting Latin America and Latin American countries?
Thank you very much. Now I'll switch to English so I can reciprocate my colleagues in the panel. Well, initially I spoke about the internal actions, right, that a country needs to take in order to reinforce the democracy and also to remain as a stable country. For us, for Panama, it's very important to also the regional coordination. So Panama is part of something called ADD. It actually is not only part, it's a like a initial member, let's say, of the ADD, which is the Alliance. It's not deficit, attentional deficit. It's Alliance for Development in Democracy. We thought that we should meet more often and coordinate with those countries in the region that have similar paths and similar values. Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, and later on, Ecuador joined. The good thing about this is that the US has shown a lot of interest and has supported our initiative, not only for the democratic values, but the empowerment of the economic aspect of a country that is a democratic country that is stable. That's why it's called Alliance for Development in Democracy. But the European Union has also given a lot of support to this initiative. And Panama, as a founder member, received that as a way to support, as a empowerment for the path that the country has taken throughout these last 2 decades. Now, another important aspect that has been mentioned already by the panelists, Javier and Enrique, is the capacity to coordinate these groupings. I will say grouping is not the right word, maybe to coordinate these countries under the perspective of Latin American countries. We are very different within ourselves. Even though we speak the same language, we pray to the same God. Many of us like frijoles and tortillas, but we have different backgrounds and different history. Panama, as I have mentioned, has played a very interesting role of a bridge due to the geographic and historic characteristics of our country. So for us, for Panama, to remain a country, a balanced and a country that believes in dialogue, constructive dialogue, is very relevant for countries like US and Europe and the European Union. Why? Because you need that bridge. You need that country that helps you facilitate. You need that country that understands everyone. You need that country that is South American, Central American, and Caribbean, and at the same time share values with you. So the solutions need to come from the region, from main actors. And it has been mentioned by Javier and also by Enrique. So we appreciate, in fact, we feel very positive, and we want to congratulate Spain because I was part of those meetings in Brussels and in Buenos Aires, and I saw how it was. It was very interesting. The beginning was difficult. And then we say everything we wanted to say. And then we met. And we tried to constructively find solutions that not necessarily are unilateral, one vision, univision. No, solutions that take everyone into consideration and respect the diversity. And finally, I like to highlight that, for instance, countries like Panama that share common values with the United States, common history. For us, it's important to be cherished. Sometimes we tend to talk and engage in diplomatic talks with countries that are different, are going to the different track. And we ignore those that have been there with us for so many years, sharing values, all friends that have been always with us. So we should never take that for granted. That was the point, and it was highlighted also. We should always cherish those old friends, and we should always respect those countries in the region that have the capacity to be a bridge between everyone. So if those countries remain as a credible mediator, as a credible articulator, that's under everyone's benefit. And I wanted to just close with that because I think it was important for me to highlight the role of Spain in bringing Latin America closer to the European Union, and the role of the United States in empowering the ADB and every coordination that aims to strengthen the democratic values in Latin America. So we see it as a circle. You can start with small circle of countries and then it will expand because those countries will play the role and the balance within the region.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tawani. Ambassador Moore, I'm going to head over to you. So, you know, we've sort of discussed here the shared values between democratic nations, the importance of multilateral organizations and strengthening democracy in Latin America. But how do you bring in those countries or those leaders that do not view multilateral organizations as either legitimate or helping them or even their intervention in their own borders, right? How do you deal with anti-democratic leaning leaders who have perhaps gotten to power, as Benjamin sort of alluded to in his introductory remarks, through the electoral process, so they have electoral legitimacy, but once they're in power, they debilitate democratic norms, principles, institutions. So how does, for example, the OAS deal with these kinds of leaders in Latin America, and how do you see the EU, Spain working together to bring them back into a rule-based order?
So yes, that is the challenge, isn't it? You know, we were talking about how democracy is at risk, but these same anti-democratic forces are not just undermining the rule of law and democratic institutions; they're also attacking international institutions. International institutions are being questioned and challenged the same way that democracy is being challenged in many countries in the region. So that's another reason why it's so important to stay focused on strengthening and demonstrating the same way you want to demonstrate that democracies can deliver. Mm-hmm. You have to demonstrate that international institutions can also deliver, right? On the issue of democracy. Lila, here in about a week or so, Nicaragua will be leaving the OAS. Mm-hmm. As you know, Nicaragua denounced the charter. There's a 2-year process. The Permanent Council met last week and approved and adopted a resolution that said, among other things, one, reminding the Nicaraguan regime that they still have obligations under the American Convention on Human Rights and other instruments and treaties. So the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights will continue doing its work in Nicaragua, even though Nicaragua is no longer has a seat or a space at the OAS. And the second thing that the resolution states is that essentially the OAS, the Inter-American system, will not abandon the Nicaraguan people, right? It will, just because the regime decided to leave, that doesn't mean that we're remain silent and that we will abandon the Nicaraguan people. We will not do that. And so that's an important resolution, important commitment that that I think the organization and member states are making. There are others, of course. But listen, I understand the organization is based on consensus and should be inclusionary. But we will do everything possible to ensure that collaboration, that coordination, that consensus, that dialogue continues. But we cannot sacrifice our values, right? We can't set our values aside because we want to make sure that a government decides that it wants to leave the organization. That's a decision that Nicaragua made. The OAS did not make that decision. This is a decision that basically the Nicaraguan regime decided that it could no longer withstand the pressure, took its marbles and went home. And that's what's occurred. That's unfortunate, but that's what happened. So we have to sort of remain committed to that. And I think collaboration and coordination with the European Union on these issues, I think the Director General mentioned this, is very important. Last point on the issue of democracy. So the threat to democracy today is the crisis of confidence that citizens have of democracy. Right? The inability to deliver the goods. What have you done for me lately, right? The perception that democracies can't govern. That was very different than when the Inter-American Democratic Charter was adopted, which the levels and confidence for democracy was sky high. And at that point, the threat was thought to be from the military. And the charter was written around that particular threat. Fast forward over 2 decades, the challenge is different. Levels of confidence around, the level of cynicism is high. And then you throw in there issues of corruption, insecurity, and then the point you make, Lila, which is you have democratically elected governments, right? Legitimately elected governments who are using mechanisms of democracy to undermine democracy. That was never envisioned in 2001, right? And so the question is, how do we as an organization, and I think as governments as well, confront this complex challenge to democracy in the region? And that's why I think, one, we can't stop talking about it. We have to insist upon it. We can't give up on it. And that's why, as I mentioned in my initial remarks, the organization seems to be saying, okay, got it, check. What can we do to address this particular challenge? And I think that's going to be a healthy debate, a healthy discussion. It's going to be challenging, but I think it's one that needs to be had, and where the United States, again, has an indispensable role to play along with other international institutions.
And I think what you mentioned, Ambassador, in your first remarks was civic education, right? And I think that that's extremely powerful to remind citizens of what life actually doesn't look under a democracy, because there's an indifference, right, to the type of regime now in many countries,
Right.
Of, whether it's populism or authoritarianism, they're sort of more indifferent than they were in the past.
That's correct.
Enrique, I want to ask you a more specific question to Spain. What can the EU and the U.S. do to further Spain during its presidency of the Council of Europe? So what can they do? What kind of mechanisms can be put in place? What kind of programs, initiatives that can really sort of bring together both, three angles, bring them together a little bit further?
Well, considering the fact that there's only 1 month left of presidency.
That's why I ask it.
But anyway, we'll do our most. Yeah. Well, now seriously. I think that we have laid the foundations of what we wanted to do. As you know, we internally have a domestic situation that cannot be more inopportune because we wanted to have a very significant presidency. But I think that despite that fact, we have carried out our program quite well. And the idea, we mentioned it before, is putting Latin America in the center of the external action of the European Union. And even if it sounds a bit boasting about it, that we succeeded in that sense, because now we have put the Latin American dialogue on track. We're going to have a summit in 2025 and then another one in between of ministers of foreign affairs. So I think that that has been an important moment for that's our goal, and it has been achieved. We had also sub-regional, as Thomas mentioned, a sub-regional meeting with the CARICOM countries, because I think that we have to bring the Caribbean closer to the European Union. We had the United Kingdom in the European Union, and it's not there any longer. So I think this is a moment that we have to take profit and try to have a holistic vision of the Caribbean in its whole. Then, with the United States, we're in dialogues. We have a working group with the United States on Central America. I think it's quite, at least for us, it's quite important. It is quite focused in three main issues, which is migration, economic development, and political dialogue. So that will be, we'll hold our third meeting probably at the beginning of January. And I think that we have a lot of issues to speak about, because I know time is pressing, that Central America is a preoccupying matter. We have seen what is happening in Guatemala. We are worried about the recent events in Honduras. Well, El Salvador is another matter. So their part of democracy is the division of power and the state and the rule of law, and we see the judiciary in Central America is having a very hard time. So I think that the important factor we have to retain is that we need, as the ambassador mentioned, to have a very close coordination, because I think that in some countries, some other countries like Nicaragua, nothing seems to work. But in other countries, external pressure is very important, and especially it's considering the fact that both the United States and the European Union are the leader external partnerships of these countries. I think that together we can try to press forward what its common values, not only common values of us, but also of us, as you mentioned, of the populations. We have kept our cooperation, despite the fact that our relation with the Nicaraguan government is not the best one.
Perfect. Thank you. Enrique. Tomas, before I move on to you, because I do want to hear more from you on the European electoral observation missions that you mentioned, which I think are critical to Latin America. But I want to open it up to the audience. If anybody has a question, so we can take one or two and then kind of weave that into our last minutes here, because I fear that if I don't do it now, I would have promised that we would take questions, and it will never happen. Are there any questions? Yes?
Yes, I have a question. My name is Ulrico Reale. I'm a lawyer here in D.C. And my question relates to your reference to Venezuela and to the progress of democracy in Venezuela. Venezuela has announced elections, and the United States has gone along with the idea election sometime next year. How much truth there is in this?
Thank you. All right, Tomas, we'll let you answer, and then we'll do some quick answers after your remarks.
Is it me? So, hi. Sorry.
Yep, we can hear you, Tomas.
All right. Sorry.
Thank
No,
you.
just
No worries.
it's difficult from here. It's getting darker also, as you can see. First, I just wanted to underline a few things which I think are important to remember after this session. First, the inclusive approach of the European Union towards Latin America and the Caribbean. I think this is a very distinct approach. We really want to engage with every country in the region. So this idea of inclusiveness permeates all the efforts, all the documents, all the statements and efforts that we put on the table. Then the dialogue. We have different types of dialogues that we try to anchor in the institutions as much as possible. I've mentioned the outcomes of the summit, but I think that others mentioned we do have other types of dialogue that are more at the bilateral level, that are important. And there were a number of memorandum of understanding also signed during the summit with specific countries. Ecuador, El Salvador, where we actually try to also institutionalize that political dialogue aspect of our relation with our partners. But having said that, we also have in the region a number of countries with whom we have a sanction regime. We have Venezuela. I think at the very beginning, it was mentioned that it's precisely today when we have announced that we have renewed our sanctions, our individual sanctions. These are very specific sanctions. This is a very specific type of sanctions that the EU adopted in 2017 against, or in answering to in reply to the situation in Venezuela. They affect 54 individuals, and they have been renewed 6 months. And this has been announced today. And I think it's important to look and to read the political declaration or the press statement that has been issued, where we explain very well our position. We try to see further progress towards democratic elections in the country, and that will be factoring to our next review of the sanctions regime. But there are other sanctions regime in place, Nicaragua or Haiti, for instance. Very soon, there's going to be also a human rights dialogue with Cuba. So we're going to have our EU special envoy on human rights traveling to Cuba with a very program, and including these human rights consultations that are part of our partnership and cooperation agreement with Cuba. And then, of course, a constant engagement with civil society in these countries, and also in the margins of the summit, we had a forum of youth and also a roundtable of businesses, which I think it's important to mention. Now, on the issue of electoral observation missions, I think that, well, I've mentioned a couple in which I was part of, and as I said, all the public statements, all the pronunciations, all the different inputs and analysis that came from the mission was highly respected as a neutral actor that looked into the electoral process, and not only the electoral day, but the whole electoral campaign, when we have a full-fledged electoral observation mission. Well, this is a methodology that is well known. And I think that the final product, the outcome of those missions, those recommendations that the European Union issues, or that the mission issues, they're very important documents that actually serve to monitor and to accompany those states that have received an electoral observation to improve the processes and to improve, because at the end, democracy needs to be improved every day, every year, and those documents are extremely important as reference documents that are used by all actors, and that also serve us in our engagement with the countries to see where progress has been done and where progress has not been done. So they have a very, very, very important political but also technical value, our missions, and we will continue to support electoral processes in Latin America and the Caribbean via, among other, with other instruments, these electoral observation missions.
Thank you, Tomas. Ambassador Mora, Enrique, if you want to address the gentleman's question on Venezuela really quickly, we do have 6 minutes, so no pressure, but.
Okay. So I'll be brief. Yes, sir. So yeah, our expectations is that the Maduro authorities will respect the agreement signed with the democratic forces of Venezuela in Barbados. I completely understand the skepticism that might exist as to whether Maduro will agree to those agreements. There's a structure, there's a timeline, there's an incentive structure, and our expectation is that they will do all the proper follow-up. If there isn't the follow-up, if they don't follow up on their commitments, then there's a process of restoring basically the status quo ante. So, but I think it's important that here there's an important opportunity, if not a historic opportunity, for there to be not just an election, but democracy and the rule of law restored in Venezuela. But there is a process that will lead ultimately to an election next year. But critical, or at least in the short term, as the Secretary of State said recently on the Hill, that by November 30th, there has to be a clear mechanism by which Maria Corina Machado and others will be given the opportunity, as she won in the primaries, to run in a general election.
Thank you. Did you have anything to add, or should we ask one more question?
Yes, I wouldn't add a iota. The only thing is that we hope that the process moves forward. As Tomas mentioned, we have published today our sanctions. Our sanctions are very limited. They are personal sanctions. And the change in this renewal is that it will be for 6 months, as to show that we want to revise the events that might happen. It is also true that Venezuela has shown us that we have to be extremely cautious because they always find a way of getting into our logic, and it is always difficult with them. How much of compliance we can take the 30th of November, that will be the challenge.
Wonderful. Unfortunately, we have come to the end, so I'm glad we got at least one question in there. I want to thank, on behalf of the Wilson Center, the Latin America program, thank you everybody who's here with us in person, to our virtual viewers, and a reminder that on November 20th, there will be another event on environment and marine conservation between the EU and the US, so tune in into that. And just another quick reminder that this event and this conversation today will be up and published on the Latin American Program's website in the upcoming days. Thank you so much to everyone here. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. It's been a great honor.